up, Senior High? I hope you guys are doing well. I thought I would switch up the environment for you guys, try something a little bit different, but I want to welcome you guys to our lesson tonight. We are actually starting a new series on the Old Testament, and we are going to learn about the story of Israel, the story of God's people. And specifically tonight, we are going to be looking at how God chose his people. What was his purpose for Israel? And now, interestingly, to understand God's calling of Israel, we have to understand the garden. And this is why I'm standing here at the prayer garden at church. And you'll see that when we start to begin the lesson, we're going to take you back to the Garden of Eden. And here's the main point that I want you guys to come away with tonight, is that God's calling of his people and his calling of Israel in the Old Testament is really a calling back to the garden. It's a calling back to what humanity's purpose was, in holiness and in obedience, and therefore in blessing with God and people being able to dwell with God in paradise. And so you guys will see that as we continue tonight and throughout the rest of this series. And so I hope you guys enjoy the narrative of the Old Testament and seeing what God's call to Israel actually is. We have to begin in the garden. God created a world in which humanity lived in a land of abundance and blessing. Adam and Eve worshiped God and dwelt with him. They were not separated from his presence. They were the pinnacles of creation, God's ultimate creation. Paradise was like a magnificent living temple in which they were the priests. And the image of their God was not on carved statues like in the pagan temples. It was on them. They had the image of God on themselves. Adam and Eve lived in perfect obedience and unity with God and were told to be fruitful and to multiply. And so we get this grand image of what true humanity is supposed to look like, what the potential for humanity could be as God purposed it. But they sinned. Disobeyed. And were taken out of paradise. They had a curse put upon them. They were removed from God's presence. And along with it, his blessings. And so the whole narrative of the Old Testament and the entire Bible is, how can this purpose for humanity actually find its fulfillment? How can it be brought about once again? And we see this small shred of hope in the seed or the offspring of the woman in Genesis 3:15, who will crush the head of the serpent, essentially undoing the curse that the serpent helped to bring about. That is the beginning of God calling his people. He is going to undo the curse and bring humanity back to his purposes in the garden of blessing and obedience and unity with him. So how will this happen exactly? Well, God promised that it would take place through the seed of the woman. And so God simply chooses people based on his grace to bring about this restoration. Now these people, of course, weren't perfect. It's all grace. But in his calling throughout the Old Testament, God is trying to restore his purposes for humanity. We see this played out powerfully in the calling of Abraham. Actually, right before this story is the Tower of Babel. And it says, "The Lord scattered the people over the face of the whole earth." Genesis 11:9. So there is chaos. But only a few short verses later, in Genesis 12:1, it says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.'" And so we see in God's calling of Abram, who later becomes Abraham, a calling back to the garden. God sends his word to Abram. It's a calling to the people out of chaos. God's voice in the chaos, just like in Genesis when God created the world. We see a promised land of blessing, which is like the land that Adam and Eve had in the garden, a land of blessing. We also see a call to be fruitful and to multiply, a promise that Abraham will be the father of a great nation. And we see in the Old Testament that God's people do multiply. They become the nation of Israel. And even when they become slaves in Egypt, God continues to send them his word and promise them a land of blessing where God himself will dwell with them, just like he did in the garden. Moses leads them out of Egypt and takes them just to the verge of the promised land. There is such great hope for this renewed humanity, this new Adam that the people of Israel are supposed to be. And this is what Moses says to them in Exodus 19, 3-6. And hear the calling back to the garden. "Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, 'This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites.'" And in Deuteronomy 28, we see this language echoed with the language of blessings and curses. Blessings for the Israelites if they obey the covenant, but curses if they disobey. And again, God is calling them back to humanity at the garden. We see the theme of obedience and holiness, that the people are called to be holy. And when they're holy, they will be blessed. We see that they're God's treasured possession, just like Adam and Eve were. They're called priests, like Adam and Eve in the temple of the living garden. God calls his people to holiness and perfect righteousness, and that through this righteousness, his people will enjoy the blessings of being with God. But, as we will see in the weeks to come, this is a problem. Because the people God has chosen are too much like the old Adam and not enough like a new one. They are people of the flesh who cannot obey the law, just like Adam could not in the garden. And so their hopes of blessing and abundance are dashed. And they await for God to still restore them to that place. And so, as we continue this series and we have discussion in life groups and with our friends, I hope that you will see that this story of Israel is not just true in a very literal way, but also that the truth of this story transcends the bounds of history. It's a story of humanity. And it's a story of you and me. That God has illustrated this, that he's put down on paper, that he's shown us throughout history, so that we can understand ourselves even better as we read about God's chosen people. See, here's the truth. We all desire the garden. We all desire paradise. And God desires it for us. But on our own, just like Israel, we too are too much like the old Adam. Their story is our story, a story of unattainable perfection, unattainable blessing, an unattainable presence with God, because we sin, because we cannot obey God. There's something inside of us that does not allow us to perfectly obey God in every way. And so we see from the story of Israel and the story of Adam and throughout the Bible and even in ourselves that we too need something new and better. We need a new and better Adam. We need a true and better Israel. One that is perfectly obedient, because we need a new humanity. We want the humanity that was in the garden before we fell. And so we need to go back to that place. And I want you to know that Jesus is the one. He is the new and better Adam. And he is the true Israel that is perfectly obedient to God. Jesus is the new humanity. It's his righteousness that brings about blessing from God. And it's his obedience that brings about God's presence. And Jesus does it for us because we can't do it ourselves. And so when we put our faith in Jesus, then we too are seen like Jesus, as if his righteousness and his obedience and his ability to obey is our own. And so therefore we also receive the blessing of the garden and the restoration of the new heaven and the new earth and the new humanity, resurrection bodies that will come about one day when God takes us back to paradise. And he not only takes us back, but he brings paradise here. He brings heaven to earth, and we will be able to dwell with him in his presence in the fullness of joy. And so I hope that is an encouragement to you. I hope that that helps you make sense of the Old Testament and the calling of Israel, what they were supposed to be, a nation set apart, holy, a calling back to the garden. And as we will see in the weeks to come, that they were not able to fulfill that. And they point us to the one who can. All right, guys. I love you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. And I am always praying for you. If you ever need anything, feel free to reach out. And I hope to see you guys soon. Take care.